It was supposed to be another routine hearing, another day of scripted answers, tired outrage, and a public too numb to care. But then AOC raised her hand, looked directly into the camera, and held up one page. Just one. A redacted government invoice with one glaring detail still visible. $2.4 billion paid, and nothing delivered. The room fell silent. Reporters blinked. And somewhere across the country, Elon Musk posted one image. A filing cabinet cracked open. No caption. Just the sound of panic echoing through every hallway in Washington. Moments later, Trump erupted online in all-caps fury, screaming betrayal, threatening consequences, unraveling live before a nation that had already seen enough. But here's the thing. This story, the alliance between the world's most unpredictable billionaire and one of Congress's most unflinching voices, was never about politics. It was about truth, about a system that hoped no one would look too closely until someone finally did. And yes, this story is a dramatization. The characters are real, the details imagined. But the rage is real, the exhaustion is real, and the question it asks, that's as real as it gets. What happens when someone actually opens the drawer marked "Do Not Disturb" and shows the world what's inside? Stay with us. The page is turning. Subheading: When the wrong man spoke the right words. The afternoon heat in Austin was unrelenting, even inside the cool, humming walls of the Innovation Summit. The kind of heat that made shoulders slump and minds wander. Even in rooms packed with tech CEOs, policy analysts, and reporters checking their phones for something, anything, worth breaking a headline. By 3:40 p.m., most people had mentally clocked out. Then the stage lights shifted. Elon Musk stepped into view, quietly. No dramatic intro, no music, just the faint click of cameras resetting their focus. He didn't wave, he didn't smile. He simply stood in front of a wide screen that flashed white, then faded to black, and finally settled on a line of text in stark capital letters. The future is ours if we stop sabotaging it. A few murmurs fluttered through the room. Some assumed it was branding, a campaign slogan maybe. Musk adjusted the mic with one hand and glanced at his phone. Then he spoke. Trump's COVID stimulus bill? He said, like someone repeating a question he'd been holding in for too long. It was a dumpster fire. The room stiffened. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Reckless, bloated, dressed up in language about relief and rebuilding. But really, it propped up obsolete industries, rewarded the same companies that stalled innovation, and handed out contracts with zero oversight. For a moment, no one moved. Not the panelists seated behind him, not the audience, half of whom were now sitting up straighter. He continued, not louder, but slower, more deliberate. We funded waste. We funded friends of friends. We called it economic recovery, but most of it never made it to the people or sectors that could have built something better. Something lasting. Phones lit up, cameras focused. Some in the front row exchanged glances, unsure if they were witnessing a mistake or a moment. Elon didn't pace. He didn't joke. He just told the room what he believed, and it landed like a quiet thunderclap. One of the companies that got over $400 million under that bill? Orion Strategic Technologies, the same firm that sued Tesla in 2023. We fought them. We won. But somehow, they still won the public money. He looked down again, scrolling briefly before adding, and now those same players want a second chance. They're banking on silence, on forgetfulness, on noise. The crowd wasn't cheering, but they were listening. You could feel the attention shifting, not because he was trying to stir controversy, but because for once he wasn't spinning anything. Then came the final line. Backing Trump-aligned candidates in 2026 isn't just bad politics anymore. It's dangerous for innovation, for integrity, for the country. That was it. No closing joke, no flashy slideshow, just a beat of silence. Then he stepped off the stage as the next speaker's name blinked onto the schedule screen, completely out of place. The moment didn't go viral instantly, but it didn't have to. It hung in the air like a quiet warning. And somewhere, in a much smaller office in Washington, D.C., A congresswoman known for asking hard questions and refusing easy answers watched the clip on mute. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. But she opened a drawer and pulled out a file labeled Emergency Procurement, Pending Review. By the time the clip reached her, the sun was beginning to drop behind the Capitol dome. The halls were quieter than usual. Most staffers had already left for the day, and those who remained moved like they were pacing out the tail end of a long shift. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the long conference table in her office, a half-drunk cup of cold coffee to her right, a stack of documents fanned out before her. Hearings were coming, and she was preparing the way she always did, with quiet focus, reading everything twice, sometimes 3 times, pausing only to underline the parts that didn't sit right. When her chief of staff stepped in without knocking, holding a tablet, she looked up but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He knew the difference between an interruption and an emergency. This apparently was the latter. "It's Elon," he said, placing the screen in front of her. She tapped play, and the clip started in the middle of the now viral speech, the one from the tech conference in Austin. The room was sleek, the lighting clinical, and there he was, Elon Musk, standing still, speaking slowly, not a joke in sight. No flamethrowers, no Mars metaphors, no memes. Just a man in a black t-shirt reading numbers off a phone like they meant something more than headlines. He was talking about contracts, oversight, waste. She didn't react at first, didn't ask for a second clip. She just watched until it ended and then let the silence fill the room. Her staffer finally spoke. "Everyone's trying to figure out what he's doing. If he's trying to backhand Trump or just float something controversial, the usual." AOC leaned back slightly, eyes still on the screen. "He's not floating anything," she said almost to herself. "He's landing it." There were plenty of reasons to stay quiet. Musk wasn't exactly known for consistency, and aligning with him publicly would bring noise from every side. Cable news would spin it, online pundits would dissect it, and she'd be expected to explain a connection that didn't exist, at least not in any formal sense. But she also knew something else, something simpler. When you see a crack in the wall that wasn't there yesterday, you don't wait for permission to look through it. So she picked up her phone, opened Twitter, and typed out a sentence. No hashtags, no mentions, no hashtags, no emojis. Some billionaires still care about receipts. She hit send, then set the phone face down on the table and returned to her documents as if nothing had happened. But everything had. Within 5 minutes, the quote tweet was everywhere. Screenshots, reaction threads, even early headlines. The comment didn't confirm anything. It didn't deny anything either. It was just ambiguous enough to leave room for interpretation. And in Washington, ambiguity has a habit of growing roots faster than certainty. Journalists called it curious. Supporters called it strategic. Detractors, predictably, called it calculated virtue signaling. But no one could look away. The tweet landed differently because it didn't sound like part of a campaign. It didn't sound like it was written for attention. It sounded like something she might have said aloud in a closed meeting, casually before moving on. And maybe that's what made it powerful. Musk, for his part, didn't respond. He didn't like it. He didn't retweet it. But somewhere in the chaos, a user noticed that for a brief moment, just a few seconds, he had hovered over her page. A screenshot caught his profile hovering near the tweet before disappearing again. That was all the internet needed. Theories bloomed. Some said it was coordinated. Others guessed he had sent her data. One user posted a split image, Musk's speech beside her tweet, with the caption, "Two different storms, one direction." But inside AOC's office, nothing had changed. The hearing prep continued. The files stayed open. She didn't need to say more. Not yet. Sometimes the best way to hold the room isn't by speaking louder. It's by making them lean in. And that's exactly what they were doing. The halls of the Rayburn House office building always felt different at night. Quieter, yes, but not just in sound. After the daytime shuffle of hearings, media scrums, and endless committee prep faded away, something more subtle settled in. The building became slower, more honest in a strange way. You could hear the click of a single keyboard from down the hall. The whir of the vending machine sounded almost intrusive, Staffers who stayed late often worked with their office doors half open, not out of carelessness, but because there was a kind of trust, or maybe just fatigue, that came after hours. It was close to midnight when the janitor noticed the envelope. No markings, no return address, just a pale manila sleeve, slightly bent, leaning against the bottom of Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's office door. He paused. People drop things all the time. Flyers, donor letters, misplaced mail. But this one was different. Not because it looked suspicious. In fact, it was its plainness that made it odd. Almost too plain. The door was locked, of course, in the office dark. But protocol was clear. Anything slipped under a door after hours, especially in a federal building, had to be logged. He placed it gently on the staff assistant's desk inside and made a quiet note in the nightly incident report. By morning, it was already waiting when AOC arrived, coffee in hand, scarf still knotted tight around her neck. She wasn't expecting anything new. Her calendar was full, her prep list long, and she'd promised herself no surprises before noon. But the envelope, unsealed and unclaimed, sat on the desk like it had something to say. She didn't open it right away. She read through the morning briefings, answered a few urgent messages, and then, when the office was still quiet and the sun just beginning to wash through the blinds, she picked it up and slipped the contents into her laptop. A single USB drive, black, unbranded. Taped on one side, a yellowing label in hurried handwriting. Start with contract hashtag 459-B. The rot runs deeper. No signature, no explanation, just that. Her fingers hovered briefly over the trackpad before she clicked into the folder. Inside, PDFs, dozens. Some titled by contract numbers, others by agency names she recognized from previous investigations. She opened the one labeled 459B first. It wasn't what she expected. No big scandal, no explosive smoking gun, just rows and rows of delivery records, vendor invoices, contract sign-offs. At first glance, it looked clean, ordinary, but she knew how to read between lines, how to see what wasn't there. It took less than a minute to spot the pattern. Repeated vendors, identical invoice numbers across different states, expedited payment authorizations without shipment confirmations, and buried in the middle, multiple PPE contracts totaling over $18 million, all marked delivered, all showing zero tracking data. She sat back, resting her chin lightly on her hand, eyes narrowed, not in disbelief but in something colder, familiarity. She'd seen patterns like this before. Not this exact one, but this flavor. The way documents try to look boring when they're anything but. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. A staffer passing by asked if she wanted to flag it to the committee chair right away. She shook her head gently, still scrolling, still reading. "No," she said softly. "We're not making this public. Not yet. Not because it wasn't real, not because it wasn't serious, but because sometimes if you show your hand too early, the people you're after learn to fold theirs faster. And if someone went to the trouble of slipping this through a locked door in the middle of the night, they didn't do it for a soundbite. They did it for the long game. And she intended to play it. Quietly, carefully, thoroughly. Because the rot, if the note was right, wasn't just deep. It was still spreading. The next morning began without drama. No breaking news alerts, no urgent calls from cable producers, no last-minute invitations to appear on evening panels. It was, in the most deceptive way possible, quiet. That suited Alexandria just fine. She preferred it that way, at least when the work called for more thinking than talking. The envelope from the night before hadn't left her desk. The USB had been removed, cataloged, scanned offline, and now existed on a secure drive available only to two people. Her and a legal advisor she trusted precisely because he didn't overreact. She picked up where she left off. Most of the documents were what bureaucrats would call routine. Purchase orders, vendor summaries, procurement forms. But she knew better than to take them at face value. Patterns weren't always hiding. Sometimes they were staring right at you, waiting for you to stop assuming things were normal, just because they looked like they followed procedure. Page after page revealed the same rhythm. Funds authorized, vendors approved, goods marked delivered. But there was no evidence that anything had actually arrived. No shipping logs, no fulfillment reports, just signatures, some of them familiar, others oddly identical across contracts from different agencies in different states. She paused more than once to make notes in the margins, names to search, codes to flag, numbers to compare later. And then she saw it, a line item tucked between two larger contracts, Orion Strategic Technologies. The name rang faintly, not because of government work, but because of a fight it had picked years earlier with Elon Musk. A lawsuit buried in tech media headlines at the time over IP disputes and breach of contract. Tesla had won, but here Orion was again, somehow managing to win government bids in the middle of a public health emergency. She leaned back in her chair, slowly exhaling through her nose. Things like this didn't happen by accident. A company with a known history of litigation, with a track record of filing lawsuits and dodging delivery accountability, wasn't supposed to be receiving multi-million-dollar federal contracts, certainly not without someone noticing. But apparently, no one had. Or more likely, no one had cared to. By mid-morning, she had filled 4 pages of notes. Each flagged instance followed the same general structure: a single supplier, high-value PPE orders, marked as delivered, and no audit trail. Most of the documents passed compliance checks on paper. But what they lacked was what made them dangerous. Not errors, but omissions. She scheduled a short meeting under strict confidentiality. Just one legal advisor, someone who had worked with her on past oversight cases and understood how to look past noise. No staff, no aides, no recordings. He read quietly for nearly 20 minutes before speaking, flipping through the stacks slowly, his finger pausing on one of the Orion pages. "These contracts," he said carefully, "are clean enough to pass inspection. If you're looking from a distance, but they're also dirty enough to bury people, if you know where to dig." Alexandria didn't react much. She rarely did when something truly serious landed in front of her. She just nodded once and set her pen down beside the folder. It was too early to go public, too early to wave documents in front of cameras and call it justice. The numbers had to be verified, the signatures cross-checked, the companies traced through every shell they hid behind. But the signal was clear. What she had in her hands wasn't just paperwork. It was a trail, quiet, deliberate, and long ignored. And she was going to follow it, carefully, quietly. Because sometimes the most dangerous part of a scandal isn't what it shows, it's what it almost got away with. By midday, the headlines were louder than the facts. Across every major outlet, speculation was already galloping ahead of any confirmation. Some ran with curiosity. AOC aligns with Musk? Others were more eager to stir conflict. The tech-left alliance, real or reckless? A few cable networks brought in hastily assembled panels of tech pundits and political consultants, each offering wide-eyed theories cloaked as analysis. No one had a direct quote. No one had a verified source. But in Washington and Silicon Valley, that had never been a requirement for a story to spread. All it took was a suggestion, a moment, a tweet, and Elon had just posted one. No words, no explanation, just an image, a slightly ajar filing cabinet, old government issue. The drawer pulled just enough to suggest something was inside, waiting. The lighting was soft, muted, and the handle slightly worn, as if it had been opened too many times by people who didn't want to leave fingerprints. It was cryptic, even by Musk's standards. But within minutes, it had been reposted tens of thousands of times. Some captioned it with theories about whistleblowers. Others layered it with grainy screenshots from past contracts. A few just added popcorn emojis and watched the numbers climb. What made it truly magnetic, though, wasn't the image itself. It was what didn't come next. Musk didn't follow up. No comments, no replies, no quote tweets. Just that one image, left hanging in the air like a loaded sentence without a period. For Alexandria, the timing wasn't surprising. She hadn't expected him to sit still. But what did surprise her, quietly, was the restraint. He hadn't named names. He hadn't turned it into a circus, at least not yet. And still, the noise grew. Her office phone rang more times than usual, though she never picked it up. Reporters requested statements, quotes, clarifications. The usual language, Off the record, senior aide, background only, all offered with a nervous kind of urgency. Staffers brought her lists of interview requests, flagged certain anchors as friendly, and drafted polite responses she never signed. She declined all of them, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she wasn't ready to speak in fragments. Not yet. The documents she was reviewing required more than commentary. They demanded patience, pattern recognition, context. That kind of work didn't fit neatly into a 3-minute television segment or a viral clip. It had to be held close for a little while longer. But that decision didn't go unnoticed. In fact, it unnerved even those who considered themselves allies. Colleagues in the House began asking questions in passing, carefully worded, veiled in curiosity, but edged with something else. A subtle worry that her silence might mean something larger was coming. Something they weren't prepared for. The political class, after all, preferred motion over stillness. A quote could be spun, a misstep could be walked back, but a blank space, a refusal to engage, that was harder to manage, harder to predict, and in this town, unpredictability was often mistaken for danger. A junior staffer in her office remarked that morning, almost jokingly, that it was the first time they'd seen silence trend. She didn't answer. She was still looking at the same 3 contracts, each one with approval stamps but no shipment dates. The numbers were consistent. The vendor names repeated. The same 3 initials appeared in the authorizing signatures, buried under layers of federal ink. Later that afternoon, someone forwarded her a popular tweet, a side-by-side image of Musk's filing cabinet and her earlier quote tweet. No caption this time, just the pairing itself. She saved it quietly, because sometimes the signal wasn't in the noise. It was in the quiet that followed, and in who chose to wait. The Oversight Committee chamber always carried a certain weight, but today it felt heavier. Not for any overt reason, no breaking scandal, no high-profile witness, no press frenzy outside the doors. But those who'd been around long enough could sense it. The kind of quiet that didn't come from boredom, but from attention. The kind that lingered before something shifted. Alexandria arrived just before the hearing began, notes tucked neatly inside a slim folder, expression unreadable. She greeted no cameras, answered no pre-hearing questions in the hall. Her team moved with practiced calm. A few people noticed the absence of any printed speech in her hand, but didn't ask. It wasn't out of character for her to speak without notes. Still, there was something unusual about her pace, the way she scanned the dais before sitting, as if measuring the temperature of the room by instinct alone. The hearing proceeded as expected for the first hour. Routine testimonies, prepared statements, numbers recited with the polished tone of seasoned bureaucrats. Nothing overtly wrong, nothing overtly right. Just enough substance to sound official, not enough to stick. And then it was her turn. She didn't adjust the mic. She didn't clear her throat. She simply reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and held it up. It was a standard government contract page until it wasn't. The identifying information had been redacted in thick black lines, per protocol, but one line remained untouched. $18,320,000 listed under expedited emergency delivery. There were no dates, no shipment verification, just the amount and a signature, barely legible, but consistent with others she'd flagged before. She held the page still for a few seconds longer, letting the silence do what words couldn't. Then, without looking down, she said evenly, "This document concerns $18 million in taxpayer funds allocated for emergency public health response. No accusation, no raised voice, no grandstanding, just a fact." There was a pause. Not the usual kind where people wait for applause or rebuttal, but the kind where rooms hold their breath. Some leaned forward, others sat back, unsure what to do with the stillness. One reporter later said the room didn't feel quiet, it felt held. A colleague seated 2 chairs away shifted uncomfortably, not because of what she had said, but because of what she hadn't. In a city fueled by performance, restraint was unsettling. Alexandria didn't elaborate. She placed the paper face down on the desk in front of her, folded her hands gently, and listened as the session moved on. The moment passed as quickly as it came. No one objected. No one interrupted. But inside the press gallery, the moment had already escaped the room. 12 seconds. That's all it was. From the time she lifted the page to the time she spoke. By the end of the hour, the clip had made it to Twitter, then TikTok, then Instagram stories and message boards and Reddit threads. Within 6 hours, it had crossed 6 million views. There was no caption, no fiery soundbite, just a still image of her holding a redacted page and a soft voice recounting a number that should have meant something to everyone in the room and outside it. Commenters tried to fill the space she had left open. Some speculated on what else she knew. Others debated the signature at the bottom of the page. But most just shared it without comment, as if it said more that way. She didn't respond to the attention. Not that day. She simply reviewed the next file in her folder, drew a small circle around another familiar vendor name, and made a note in the margin. Because she understood something that day's headlines didn't yet grasp. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is show up with proof and say almost nothing at all. It was still dark in Washington when the first alert buzzed through phones left charging overnight. For most, it was just another morning. Too early for noise, too late for dreams. But inside the Beltway, especially among those who worked in offices where every word could tip a scale, the notification had a different weight. Trump had posted, and not just a passing jab or late-night grievance. This one arrived with the sharpness of panic disguised as fury. In bold, breathless caps, AOC is a fraud. Musk is a traitor. They're coming for me. There will be consequences. No links, no explanation. Just raw, unfiltered accusation. It didn't matter if it was true. It was loud, and that was enough. The post hit social media like a dropped match in a dry forest. Screens lit up across newsrooms. Producers were called in early. Control rooms switched from pre-planned segments on inflation and border policy to scrambling graphics with words like betrayal and backlash. By sunrise, the major cable networks had all pivoted. Fox News replaced their usual cheerful background with blood-red overlays and footage from the oversight hearing, zoomed in on AOC's hand holding the contract page. Pundits asked whether she was being used, whether big tech had finally bought itself a megaphone inside Congress. A conservative talk show host opened his broadcast by calling Musk a Trojan horse of the left. Others weren't so polite. Right-wing influencers began threading together half-facts and speculation. They dug into AOC's campaign donors, posting grainy screenshots of her attending climate conferences, suggesting ties to Silicon Valley. Some clipped Musk's previous criticisms of government subsidies out of context, painting him as a man who had always wanted revenge. There was a rhythm to it, one that had been used before. Smear, speculate, repeat. But this time something felt different, because while the noise got louder, so did something else. The silence in the center. People who normally avoided political threads found themselves reading, scrolling, not necessarily agreeing, but not dismissing either. They weren't drawn to the outrage. They were drawn to the numbers, the receipts. On one independent news blog, a retired budget analyst published a quiet piece titled 18 Million Question, breaking down how emergency procurement works and how easy it is for oversight to become an afterthought. The article didn't mention AOC or Musk by name. It didn't need to. It was passed around church email lists, veteran forums, even LinkedIn. Comments weren't political. They were personal. My son was a nurse in 2020. They gave him rain ponchos when gowns ran out. Our clinic waited 6 weeks for masks. 6 weeks someone knew. Someone signed off. It wasn't that people were suddenly siding with AOC or Musk out of loyalty. It was that they were remembering. Remembering what it felt like to be told help was coming, only to watch it arrive late, or not at all. Remembering who said, "We've got this," while the numbers kept rising. And in that remembering, a quiet shift was taking place. Not left, not right. Just towards something else, something firmer. Back in her office, Alexandria was already at her desk, reading through vendor histories that stretched back years. She hadn't responded to the noise. Not the posts, not the headlines. Her team brought her summaries, but she didn't linger on them. There was nothing to clarify, nothing to defend. The truth she believed wasn't in the spin, it was in the paperwork. She highlighted another name, one she hadn't seen in the initial batch, and added it to a growing list. No press release, no reaction tweet, just the work. Because while others shouted, she was following the trail. And somewhere beneath the firestorm, more people were beginning to do the same. The fluorescent light above her desk hummed softly, barely audible over the quiet shuffle of paper and the occasional tap of a laptop key. Outside her office, the Capitol buzzed with the usual chaos. Camera crews setting up, aides rushing between hearings, reporters waiting for sound bites in marbled corridors. But inside it was still, focused. Alexandria sat at her desk, a spreadsheet open on one screen, a scanned PDF on the other. The column headers were familiar now: vendor ID, delivery date, amount authorized, item description. She'd stared at hundreds like it over the past week, but this one was different, not because of what it showed, but because of what it didn't. The contract was clear: $12 million awarded during peak pandemic panic, allocated for the purchase and expedited delivery of mobile ventilators to field hospitals across 3 states. Every box on the checklist had been ticked: approval from Health and Human Services, funding from FEMA's emergency allotment, confirmation signatures from regional procurement officers. But one line, buried toward the bottom of the delivery log, stood out: shipment status, unfulfilled. No tracking numbers, no delivery confirmation, no substitution request. She leaned in closer, scrolling back to the contract date. The funds had been cleared within 72 hours of approval, but no one had followed up after that. No red flags, no audit inquiries. Nothing to suggest anyone ever questioned why $12 million had disappeared into a vendor with no record of fulfilling a single shipment. Her staff sat a few feet away, circled around a conference table, reviewing social media response charts, pulling upticks and headlines from the morning's media blitz. The Truth Social meltdown, as they had started calling it, had spiked interest across both coasts. Even moderate centrists were beginning to ask the right questions, ones that couldn't be laughed off as partisan noise. A young aide broke the quiet first. "This is the 3rd contract we found like this in less than a week. You know it's time, right? We publish, we go full." Alexandria held up a hand without turning. "No," she said gently, "not yet." Another staffer glanced up, confused. "But why wait? The public's with us. Even people who didn't like Musk are admitting." She turned then, not abruptly, but with the kind of deliberate calm that made people listen. "They're starting to panic. You can see it. Every headline, every overreaction. They're not sure what we have. That's good. Let them sweat. Let them make mistakes." She closed the file slowly, tapping the edge of the folder twice before placing it on the growing pile to her left. "Then we drop it," she said quietly, "when they think we're done." The room didn't need further explanation. They'd seen it happen before. The news cycle moving on, the headlines shifting, the assumption that the storm had passed. That's when people exhaled too soon. That's when guards lowered. That's when truths landed the hardest. Her phone buzzed once. A notification from Twitter. She glanced at it for a second, barely raising an eyebrow. Elon Musk had liked her latest tweet. A simple message she'd posted that morning: "Accountability doesn't expire when the headlines do." No comment from him, no DM, just a single like. She didn't read too much into it, at least not out loud. But in the quiet of her office, with data stacked around her like bricks in a wall, it felt like confirmation, not of friendship, not of alliance, but of timing, of shared intent. The next folder on her desk was labeled Georgia Q2, Fulfillment Batch 7. She opened it without ceremony, pen in hand, ready to read, ready to underline, because while others played to the moment, she was charting something slower, steadier, a rhythm beneath the noise, and it was building. Capitol Hill had its own temperature, one not measured in degrees but in glances, hallway traffic, and how fast coffee orders were placed. And lately it had started to feel unseasonably warm. Not from the outside, where the press still swirled around Trump's outburst and Musk's silence, but from the inside, where the people who usually watched from the shadows, the advisors, the fixers, the lobbyists who never needed nameplates, had begun to shift in their seats. They were whispering. The first sign was subtle. A familiar face from a pharmaceutical pass bumped into one of AOC's junior staffers in the elevator. Not the kind of person who made small talk unless they had a reason. He asked a vague question about congressional digital security protocols, then chuckled too quickly and got off a floor too early. Another day, a senior aide to the House Energy Committee accidentally dropped by AOC's office with the wrong folder, except it wasn't the kind of mistake he made. And inside, someone had highlighted 3 names that happened to appear on one of the delivery logs she hadn't yet mentioned publicly. Her staff noticed the pattern before she had to explain it. The indirectness, the soft panic. These weren't political maneuvers. They were insurance checks, people trying to gauge whether they still had time to switch sides or whether the fire was already at the door. By the end of the week, a new term had begun floating through the Senate cafeterias and the lobby-adjacent steak dinners. The USB, not a USB, the USB. Some said it held thousands of contracts. Others claimed it had whistleblower testimony. One particularly anxious rumor suggested it contained video evidence of private briefings that never made it to the record. No one could agree on what was on it, only that if AOC had it, several careers were about to be over. She caught wind of the whispers during a walk between briefings. One conversation, just loud enough to catch in the stairwell, ended with someone muttering, "If she really has the USB, we're dead." That was the moment she smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not cruel, just quiet. Certain. The kind of smile that came not from knowing everything, but from knowing just enough. Later, as she sipped from a coffee cup in her office, a member of her team asked the obvious question. "Do they really think you're sitting on some all-powerful flash drive?" She didn't answer right away. She glanced at her inbox instead, scanning a new email from a low-level procurement clerk who had just offered to speak under anonymity. Then she said with a shrug so casual it nearly passed unnoticed, "I don't have it." The room paused. A few heads turned. "I just know what it said." There was a difference, and she let it hang there without further comment. No need to clarify that the USB itself had never been her leverage. The information had already been extracted, cross-referenced, verified. The drive was only a vessel. It was the pattern that mattered now. The recurring names, the unshipped goods, the money that moved without a trace of obligation. Out in the Capitol, the whispers continued. Calls were being made to attorneys, risk assessors, PR strategists. Quiet meetings were scheduled off-site, code for panic behind tinted windows. Lobbyists whispered to aides whispered to committee chairs, and committee chairs whispered to one another with guarded expressions. But inside her office, AOC was calm, focused. The storm they feared had already arrived. It just hadn't announced itself loudly. Not yet. Because the most dangerous part of a fuse isn't when it sparks. It's when it burns slowly, in silence, beneath the floorboards. Before the headlines, before the tweets and the hearings and the viral clips, before anyone ever uttered the word whistleblower. There was just James Callan, a name that barely registered beyond a government email directory, a mid-level logistics aide buried 3 layers deep inside the Office of Pandemic Response. He never imagined he'd matter, not in any grand, history book way. His job was numbers, not policy. He tracked shipments, matched inventory with delivery logs, updated dashboards that gave cabinet secretaries the illusion of control. He wasn't naive. He knew the government didn't always run clean. But he believed deep down that in a crisis, people would rise to meet the moment. That belief didn't survive April 2020. His sister Lana was a nurse at a long-term care facility in eastern Pennsylvania. 2 weeks before she died, she called James from a break room closet, her voice trembling as she described splitting a single N95 mask between 2 shifts. Patients were coughing through their bed sheets. Gloves were being rationed like medicine. And when she asked the regional supplier why the promised PPE hadn't come, they told her, politely with practiced emptiness, that everything had been delivered as scheduled. James remembered how his hands went cold on the phone. He promised her he'd look into it. He did. He ran the numbers, pulled the logs, cross-checked the vendor codes. He found the invoices. Millions of dollars paid for pallets of gear that never existed. And worse, the signatures. People he worked with, approving falsified entries. He flagged the discrepancies. quietly, carefully. A week later, his access was revoked. Lana died 3 days after that. James didn't quit right away. He told himself someone else would see what he saw. That accountability would come from the top. But as the months passed and those same vendors were rewarded with new contracts and people he used to eat lunch with got promoted, he stopped believing. He copied what he could, not to leak it, not at first, just to remember, to have something that told him he wasn't crazy, that what he'd seen wasn't just grief distorting his judgment. The USB sat in a desk drawer for 2 years. He never opened it again, didn't share it with reporters, didn't try to sell it. He watched silently as others speculated about missing shipments and ghost contracts. He watched hearings dissolve into shouting matches, press conferences filled with vague assurances and evasive talking points. Then one day, he saw her. It was just a clip, a brief oversight hearing moment, shared by someone on his timeline. A congresswoman lifting a single redacted contract into the air and saying quietly, "This document concerns $18 million in taxpayer funds." She didn't grandstand. She didn't make it about herself. She didn't even name names. But James heard it, that tone, the precision in her restraint. She knew. He hesitated for 3 more days. Then he printed one sentence on a blank sheet of paper. "Start with contract #459-B. The rot runs deeper." He slipped it inside an envelope, along with the USB, and mailed it to a congressional office address he found online. He didn't sign it, didn't track the package, didn't tell anyone, not even his wife. He just waited. And when the news began to shift, when people started asking questions no one had dared say out loud, he allowed himself, for the first time in years, to feel something closer to hope. Not closure, not justice, but the quiet knowing that maybe, finally, someone had opened the drawer. It didn't come by mail this time. No postage stamp, no crumpled envelope smuggled in under the radar. Just a flat manila folder slipped through internal channels, dropped off at the front desk of AOC's office by a courier who gave no name and disappeared down the hall before anyone could ask where it came from. At first glance, it didn't look like much. No markings, no note. Just a standard congressional folder, like the dozens that landed on her desk every week, most filled with budget updates, hearing prep, or constituent casework. But when she opened it, the air changed. Inside were printed email threads, dozens of them. Timestamps spanning March to July 2020. Subject lines like "Emergency Shipment Allocation" and PAC briefing notes, "Confidential." The messages weren't from government officials this time. They were from the other side. Lobbyists, corporate reps, campaign bundlers, and procurement officers who clearly never expected their digital conversations to see daylight. At first, the language was vague. Strategic partners, priority access, accelerated billing. But then came a thread that stopped her eyes cold. An exchange between a senior executive at a federal logistics contractor and a donor coordinator for one of the largest pandemic-era political action committees. Subject line, "Mass distribution, perception plan." The thread was short, only 3 messages long. PAC donor rep. "Some folks asking when gear hits swing districts. We need boxes, not promises." Contractor. "Don't worry about fulfillment. Optics are what matter right now." PAC. Donor rep. "Got it. We'll keep the headlines warm." No policy jargon, no attempt to dress it up, just raw cynicism. Director. Undeniable. She read it twice, then a third time. This wasn't about mismanagement anymore. It wasn't about delays, inefficiency, or corners cut in panic. This was deliberate, cold, calculated. She leaned back in her chair, holding the paper as though it might burn her fingers. Her staff watched her closely. No one spoke. After a long moment, she exhaled quietly and said, almost to herself, "This isn't just fraud, it's intentional." One aide sitting by the door whispered, "What do we do with it?" She didn't answer right away. She turned to the back page of the thread, where another line, nearly buried in a CC field, revealed a recipient with a government email address. Someone on the inside had seen this, received it, maybe even replied to it. And yet, Nothing had stopped. The contracts had kept flowing. The headlines had kept spinning. The lives behind those supply requests had kept slipping away. She placed the thread beside the Callan file. Side by side, the documents painted something bigger. This wasn't a leak. This was a map. And whoever had sent this second delivery, whoever was watching close enough to choose this moment, this folder, this proof, clearly knew exactly how much deeper the story ran. Later that afternoon, she tweeted only 4 words. Sometimes silence is strategy. No photos, no hashtags, no mention of names. Elon Musk liked the tweet within 2 minutes. A few minutes after that, a journalist from a prominent investigative outlet DM'd her office with a simple request. We have something similar. Off the record? The walls were moving, slowly, not from pressure, but from weight, truths too heavy to bury. And in the quiet hum of the office, where trust was rationed and timing mattered more than noise, she felt it. The shape of something beginning. Not a scandal, a reckoning. For hours that morning, nothing happened. No new statements, no subpoenas, no interviews. It was the kind of silence that usually means the story has died down, burned out, or been quietly absorbed by a new headline. But anyone who had been following closely could feel it. This was not the silence of retreat. It was the silence before something moved. It was around 9:20 a.m. when Elon Musk made the smallest adjustment imaginable. He didn't tweet. He didn't post a thread. He simply changed the bio on his profile. 1 line, 12 characters longer than the previous. Justice isn't always loud. That was it. No tags, no context. Just that. And yet within 15 minutes, the phrase was trending globally. No one could prove it referred to AOC, the USB, or the quietly growing storm beneath Capitol Hill. But they didn't need to. The digital crowd didn't require full sentences anymore. It needed signals. Clear, intentional, and silent enough to whisper their way into headlines without leaving fingerprints. AOC saw it mid-scroll, in between briefing notes and internal emails. She didn't pause long. No dramatic reaction. Just a soft, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. Then she tapped retweet. No comment, no emoji, just the act. And that was enough. Within the hour, media outlets were speculating about a coordinated campaign. Analysts drew connections between Musk's bio update and AOC's cryptic tweet the day before. Commentators filled airwaves asking why 2 people from opposite ends of the power spectrum, one an eccentric billionaire, the other a progressive firebrand, had begun speaking in the same coded rhythm. But while the public dissected pixels and punctuation, one man was unraveling. Trump's post came just before noon. I know what Elon did during 2020. All caps, no punctuation at the end, no further explanation. The internet froze, then burst. Reporters scrambled for context. Comment sections erupted. A few diehard supporters tried to frame it as a warning, a declaration of hidden truths. But even they seemed unsure. It didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like panic. Because here's the thing, power doesn't like being out-messaged. And Trump, for all his bluster, understood the optics of silence better than anyone. He'd built a career crafting chaos, dominating the narrative by flooding it. But now, suddenly, 2 people who had every reason not to trust each other were coordinating in whispers. And the audience wasn't tuning out. It was leaning in. Cable panels began parsing the phrase, I know what Elon did. Did he mean deals? Donations? Data? It didn't matter. The accusation, vague and wild as it was, gave the moment its next beat. But the ones paying closer attention weren't the pundits. It was the contractors, the aides, the small circle of operatives who once felt untouchable and were now refreshing bios and scanning congressional schedules like their future depended on it, because it might. Inside AOC's office, her team stayed quiet. No celebration, no gloating, just eyes on the thread, ears to the floor. She leaned over a notepad, circling a date. 3 weeks from now, a hearing already on the Oversight Committee calendar. Nothing flashy, no name recognition yet, but with just enough space in the agenda to add one item. A review, a beginning. Someone in the room asked if they should prep a statement. She shook her head. Let him keep shouting, she said softly. We're almost there. Outside, the wind had picked up along the Capitol steps. Flags pulled tighter. Leaves whispered things no mic could catch. And in that moment, it became clear to anyone paying attention. The people who yell the loudest are rarely the ones holding the match. Sometimes it's the quiet that burns everything down. The hearing room was packed long before the clock struck 10. Not just with reporters and Hill staffers, but with the kind of people who usually kept their distance from oversight sessions. Senior agency heads, corporate advisors, even a few lobbyists pretending to check their phones more than their pulses. Something was different this time. The air had a pressure to it, like everyone could feel a hinge about to turn. AOC entered without ceremony, no entourage, no fanfare. Just a quiet stack of manila folders under one arm and a sharp calmness in her expression. Her staff followed behind, each face drawn tight with focus, but without fear. They'd rehearsed this, refined it, but the weight of what was coming still pressed on every movement. When her turn came, she didn't launch into a speech. She didn't warm the room or soften the blow. She simply stood, clicked the remote in her hand, and watched the screen behind her light up. Slide 1. An invoice. $6.3 million for emergency protective equipment. Slide 2. The corresponding delivery log, blank. Slide 3. An internal memo noting the contract was accelerated due to donor relevance. Slide 4. The email chain confirming the vendor's political contributions. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She narrated. This contract, she said quietly, was expedited during the peak of the first wave. It never delivered a single unit of gear, and yet payment was processed in full within 48 hours. The vendor's name? Linked directly to a PAC that donated over $700,000 in the same quarter. The screen changed again. Another contract. Another pattern. Over and over. Signatures repeated, amounts inflated. Vendors shuffled between shell companies and political committees as if legality were just a matter of clever formatting. She didn't embellish. The facts were their own indictment. Some members on the dais shifted in their seats. Others stared at the table, hands folded. There were no interruptions, no procedural objections, no performative outbursts. The usual theater of partisan hearings gave way to something rarer, stillness. By the time she reached the final slide, the rhythm had slowed. It showed a timeline. A single federal contractor awarded over $200 million in emergency contracts in less than 5 months, despite failing to fulfill a single shipment during that period. Each contract had a political contact. Each contact had a donation. AOC paused. "This isn't politics," she said. Her voice was low but clear. "It's theft." She didn't look at anyone in particular. The words were for the room, the cameras, the record, but also for every nurse who'd begged for masks, every family who'd waited too long for a ventilator, every quiet name on the Callan file. For a moment, it was as if no one breathed. Then a rustle, a cough, a whisper of camera shutters clicking open again. But the sound that mattered wasn't heard. It was felt. The pin drop kind of silence. The kind that follows recognition. The kind that doesn't break easily. Outside, phones were already vibrating. Tweets were being drafted, calls placed, talking points scrambled. Inside, AOC stepped back from the screen and took her seat without fanfare. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her job wasn't to win, it was to reveal. And now the floor was open. Not for her, for consequences. It began with a call to C-SPAN. A man from Western Pennsylvania. Older voice. Careful cadence. "I voted for Trump twice," he said. "But if what that congresswoman showed is real, then we were all lied to. We buried my sister during that mess. No masks, no nothing." The host didn't interrupt. Just let it hang there. The air thick with something rawer than politics. Grief, trying to find footing in a world that had weaponized doubt. Then came another call. A woman from Nevada, then one from Georgia. All different tones, all different sides of the aisle. But they shared one thing. None of them could unsee what had just played out in that oversight room. The footage was everywhere. Every network played it, though each painted its own frame around the edges. MSNBC called it a reckoning. CNN used the word fraud more than once. Fox News at first dismissed it as coordinated optics, speculated it was a stunt to distract from the border, or inflation, or whatever else might pull the threat away from their base. But even they couldn't make the numbers disappear. $18 million, $6.3 million, $200 million. Figures so precise they cut through the noise like glass. Contracts with timestamps, screenshots with names, email chains laid bare without spin, without editing, without shouting. They could argue the narrative but not the ink. And in households across America, people weren't arguing at all. They were watching, quietly, a second time, then a third. Some Googled contract #459-B. Others searched for the donor firms tied to the procurement trail. A few independent journalists began building live spreadsheets online, piecing the web together in real time. One right-leaning podcast host, known more for conspiracy than clarity, broke tone mid-episode. "Look, I'm not saying I love AOC," he muttered, "but if she's the only one dragging this into daylight, I gotta ask, where the hell were the rest of them?" Online, hashtags bloomed like wildfire. #receipts matter, #show the contracts, #not just politics. A former FEMA officer tweeted, "I saw similar invoices back in 2020. Thought they were just rushed. Now I'm not so sure." Retweets surged. Verification checks didn't come fast enough. Meanwhile, AOC said nothing. No follow-up press release. No interview circuit. Her silence now wasn't strategic. It was surgical. Because every time someone else tried to spin it, they circled right back to the documents she had already placed in full public view. This wasn't narrative warfare anymore. It was arithmetic. In backyards, people talked over fences. In diners, they leaned closer to the small televisions mounted on cracked tile walls. In churches, prayer groups began asking not just for healing, but for truth. One moment from the hearing kept looping in online montages when the screen showed a chart comparing contract timelines to political donations. Bars lining up too perfectly? No narration needed, just music and silence. Even late-night hosts took a different tone. Less punchline, more pause. By week's end, a quiet ripple had turned into something heavier. Not a wave, not yet, but pressure, accumulating in the seams. People who never used the word oversight now whispered it over dinner. People who had never watched a hearing now knew which room in Congress had the best acoustics for silence. And in the quiet corners of the Capitol, staffers and strategists began asking each other the question that couldn't be buried with spin. If she has more, what comes next? He waited longer than anyone expected. In an era where seconds often define a story's lifespan, Elon Musk's silence felt unnatural, even suspicious. But in his world, timing wasn't a reaction. It was strategy. When he finally moved, it wasn't with a press conference or a live stream. It wasn't through an appearance on cable news or a phone interview with a friendly outlet. It was a thread, 12 simple tweets posted just after 2 a.m. Eastern, when most of Washington was asleep and the West Coast had begun to drift into silence. No caption, just the first image, a screenshot of a contract page. Familiar to those who had watched the oversight hearing, but from a slightly different angle. More context, additional lines, less redaction. Second tweet, a scan of a redacted delivery order, dozens of units ordered, marked urgent, then circled with a handwritten note. No dispatch available. Vendor silent. Third tweet, another screenshot. This time a simple line highlighted in blue. "We paid for care. We got nothing." That sentence wasn't in the government documents. It was Musk's. Tweet 4, a brief bullet list, dates, vendors, fulfillment rates, donor overlaps, no commentary, just numbers that spoke louder than opinion. The thread went on like that. Methodical, cold, designed not for outrage but for evidence. And then, without flourish, the final tweet, "If silence buys power, then truth rents it back, with interest." No it mentions, no hashtags, no response to Trump's previous taunts. Just data, in a tone so measured it almost dared others to argue. Within 5 minutes, it was trending globally. Journalists woke up to inboxes full of links. Policy analysts scrambled to cross-reference Musk's screenshots with the contracts AOC had unveiled days earlier. Some of the documents were new. Others filled in blanks the public hadn't known existed. Together, they created something that felt less like a leak and more like a ledger. But the quietest reply came from the person who'd set it all in motion. AOC didn't post a quote tweet, no screenshot, no emoji or hashtag. She simply reposted Musk's thread with one sentence. Now they know. That was it. No elaboration, no call to action, no performative victory lap. But for those who'd been following closely, it hit harder than any speech. Because now the evidence wasn't just on a congressional live stream. It lived in phones, on laptops, in forwarded emails between neighbors, inside conversations that could no longer be dismissed as partisanship or noise. This was clarity, not shouted, but revealed. Fox News tried a different strategy that morning. Their lead segment framed it as a targeted misinformation alliance, suggesting the documents could have been selectively chosen, even tampered with. But even their analysts couldn't explain the internal delivery notes or the donor overlaps without stumbling. CNN ran a split-screen breakdown, comparing the oversight slides to Musk's thread, almost frame by frame. The matches were unnerving, the conclusions hard to spin. And in D.C., aides who had once rolled their eyes at AOC's name began checking their own calendars for upcoming hearings, their inboxes for internal memos, their memories for who they might have CC'd when it felt like no one was watching. One tech columnist summed it up best. When Elon makes noise, the world argues. But when he whispers with AOC, people start checking their receipts. Something had shifted. The story no longer belonged to the politicians or the headlines. It belonged to the public, and for the first time in years, they didn't feel like spectators. They felt like witnesses. By midweek, the headlines had left the Beltway. They were no longer just op-eds in the Washington Post or viral threads on social media. The questions had trickled down into America's quieter places, onto the front pages of local papers, the ones still folded and delivered by hand, still passed between neighbors over morning coffee. The Youngstown Courier ran it in bold type across the top. Where did the money go? The story beneath wasn't about party lines or abstract policy. It followed a small clinic that had shuttered in 2021, just weeks after its final shipment of protective equipment failed to arrive. A nurse interviewed for the piece quietly cried as she described how she'd begged a regional supplier for just 20 more N95s, enough to make it through the week. None came. The next town over, a retired postal worker stood up at a city council meeting in Warren, Ohio, holding a printout of the Musk AOC contract screenshots. He didn't raise his voice. He just asked, if that money went somewhere, shouldn't we know where? By Thursday, public access lines to local government boards were filled with residents demanding investigations. Not protests, just pressure, quiet and consistent, the kind that's harder to ignore than outrage. And in Texas, where things don't often tilt toward AOC, a small but significant moment broke through the usual noise. The mayor of a modest town outside of San Antonio was being interviewed on a regional morning show. The segment was meant to be about infrastructure grants, nothing flashy, but halfway through, unprompted, he said, "Look, I don't agree with Representative Ocasio-Cortez on everything, but she's doing what Congress should have done years ago. She's putting receipts over rhetoric. That matters more than people think." His co-host blinked, then nodded. The clip circulated fast. Even more unexpected were the comments from faith leaders in North Carolina and Missouri. Sermons the following Sunday, some rooted in traditional doctrine, others in more progressive congregations, began quoting lines from that oversight hearing. "This isn't politics, it's theft," echoed from pulpits, paired with verses about stewardship, accountability, and the sin of negligence. The ripple wasn't a wave, it wasn't explosive, but it was real. Cable news struggled to reframe it. Opinion hosts on the far right clung to the deep state trap talking point, but it felt thinner each time they said it. Their callers weren't angry in the same familiar way. They were curious, some even quiet. That made it harder to redirect. Meanwhile, liberal commentators tried not to oversell the moment, perhaps sensing that something more delicate was taking shape. They didn't call it a movement yet, just a mirror, and for once it wasn't cracked. In senior centers across Wisconsin, residents sat in recreation rooms and watched the hearing replay. On YouTube, on CNN, even clips reposted with subtitles by younger relatives. They didn't talk much while it played, but afterward, over pudding cups and decaf coffee, they had questions. Sharp ones. In Phoenix, an HOA meeting ended early when someone raised their hand, not to complain about landscaping or parking spaces, but to ask if the city had ever received federal emergency funds during COVID. No one had the answer, but suddenly everyone wanted to find out. That's how it spread. Not with chants or hashtags, but with quiet, persistent wondering. With the kind of discomfort that doesn't shout, but simmers. AOC never claimed credit. She didn't post about town halls or re-air the Texas mayor's comments. Her feed remained spare, measured, just a few links to public records, followed by one sentence. If your community wants to know where their PPE went, you can file here. The first resignation came quietly. No press conference, no fiery exit interview. Just a scanned letter posted to the Oversight Committee's official page, time-stamped 6:02 a.m., long before most staffers had even made it to their desks. It was signed by a mid-ranking official whose name had rarely made headlines, but who, until recently, had helped authorize dozens of the now scrutinized pandemic contracts. The second followed 12 hours later. This time, the departure came with a short statement. Effective immediately, I resigned from my position on the Oversight Subcommittee on Emergency Procurement. I believe in accountability, starting with myself. Neither mentioned the USB. Neither mentioned AOC. They didn't need to. By the end of the day, Politico ran the story under the headline, "Two down and more quietly lawyered up." Inside the halls of Congress, the tone shifted. Doors that had been firmly closed to certain questions were now, if not open, then at least unlocked. Staffers who once rolled their eyes at AOC's persistence began glancing over their shoulders when she walked by. And not because they feared her temper, because they feared what she might still be holding back. Even Trump loyalists, the ones who never cracked on camera, started softening their language. On Truth Social, his inner circle stopped reposting the all-caps fury. Instead, they leaned into vaguer defenses. Nobody's perfect. COVID was chaos. Hindsight's 2020. It wasn't loyalty anymore. It was insulation. Representative Keene, once a fixture on Fox News panels defending every pandemic-era expense, canceled 2 scheduled appearances in the same week. His office cited personal obligations. Meanwhile, his staff quietly began combing through past email archives just in case. But what shook the Hill more than anything was the strange emergence of something that hadn't been seen in years. Whispers of bipartisan cooperation. By the following Monday, an anonymous source leaked a draft memo, unsigned, unattributed, but unmistakably real. It outlined a proposed emergency procurement reform panel, drawing support from both Republican and Democratic legislators not typically seen in the same room, let alone the same sentence. The proposal included calls for a forensic audit of all PPE contracts between March 2020 and January 2021, a temporary halt on federal emergency procurement discretion powers, and perhaps most striking, the creation of a permanent independent body to oversee disaster spending, outside the influence of the sitting administration, no matter the party. It wasn't law yet. It wasn't even official. But it sparked conversation, and not just in media circles. In cloakrooms, cafeterias, and committee back channels, lawmakers began floating one cautious question. If we don't back this, what happens when the next USB shows up? Some tried to frame the moment as a reckoning. AOC didn't. She said little publicly, beyond reposting the resignation letters with a single line of commentary. Accountability begins when deflection ends. There were no parades, no triumphal interviews. Her tone remained as even as it had been on day one. But beneath the surface, change was taking root. And not just legislative change. Public trust, something so frayed, so brittle in the post-pandemic years, was starting to reassemble itself in the most unexpected corners. Small-town mayors, civil service watchdogs, even conservative editorial boards began acknowledging that the problem wasn't just mismanagement. It was the expectation that mismanagement would always go unpunished. AOC, through sheer discipline, had disrupted that expectation. She had done it without shouting, without gloating, without offering false hope. She had done it by holding the story in her hand, piece by piece, and placing it in the public's view. Not as a bombshell, but as a mirror. And now the reflection was making its way through the halls of power. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a reckoning had begun, and it was just loud enough to hear. The folding chairs didn't match. The ceiling fan ticked like a metronome. And the old community center in the Bronx, paint chipped, air slightly too warm, hummed with quiet anticipation. This wasn't a press event. There were no journalists, no microphones clipped to lapels, no podium flanked by flags, just neighbors, teachers, single moms, a retired transit worker in a MELTS cap, a room full of people who didn't need to be convinced, only respected. The event was a small one, a youth literacy fundraiser tucked into a Thursday night, the kind where a local band plays too loud, kids chase balloons in the back, and someone inevitably forgets to bring napkins for the rice and beans. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had only planned to attend, not speak. But as the final raffle ticket was drawn and the room began to shift toward cleanup, someone gently asked her, softly, almost as an afterthought, if she wanted to say a few words. She looked up, paused, then stood. There was no grand entrance, no clearing of the throat. She walked to the microphone and rested her hand against the wobbly stand. Her voice came soft, steady, the kind of tone used not for debate, but for truth. She didn't mention hearings, or headlines, or Elon Musk. Instead, she spoke about her mother, about the week the rent went up and the paychecks didn't, about splitting a box of pasta 3 ways and making it stretch 4 nights, about the quiet generosity of neighbors who left winter coats on doorknobs when they knew yours didn't zip anymore. She spoke about what people feel when they see billions disappear into headlines, when no one ever explains how, or why, or who. And then, not with a flourish, not for applause, just simply, she said, "Truth doesn't belong to a party. It belongs to the people who paid for it." She didn't pause afterward, didn't wait for reaction. She kept going, mentioning community budgets, town halls, the small work done far from cameras that builds trust inch by inch. But the room had already changed. A woman in the 4th row stood up, slowly, then another. Then hands came together, not loudly but deliberately. A standing ovation not made of sound, but of meaning. No chants, no hashtags, just acknowledgement. She stepped away from the mic, returned to her folding chair beside an elderly woman in a patterned scarf who passed her a paper plate of arroz con gandules without a word. There were no headlines that night, no trending hashtags, no tweets or camera flashes. But in barbershops the next morning, people talked about it. In the church basement where they wrapped meals for delivery, in the pharmacy where the clerk recognized her face and whispered, "She made us feel seen." For AOC, that moment wasn't about a USB or a committee hearing. It wasn't about taking down a name or winning a debate. It was about reclaiming something that had quietly slipped away from too many for too long. The right to demand answers without being told they were asking too much. The right to expect care without being accused of weakness. And most of all, the right to believe that the truth belongs to them, not to the rich, not to the loudest voice in the room, but to the people who paid for it and waited too long for someone to say it out loud. By now, they all had a name for it. Not officially, of course, but in back hallways and Slack channels, whispered in elevators between Hill staffers and junior aides, it was simply called the USB moment. No memo announced it. No committee hearing spelled it out. But the tone in the Capitol had shifted. Something had lodged in the walls, like a faint but permanent vibration. You could feel it in how lobbyists avoided eye contact in certain corridors, or how oversight interns suddenly carried notepads instead of phones. Quietly, almost too smoothly, new draft legislation circulated. Tighter audit protocols, real-time disclosure on emergency spending, a clause on post-crisis contract reviews, provisions no one had dared propose before now. Behind closed doors, lobbyists made frantic calls. Their clients asked if these proposals would actually stick. Would this fade like the others? Or had that one line, "This isn't politics, it's theft," actually pierced through? AOC refused every interview request, the Sunday shows, the editorial boards, even the podcasts that once hosted her in friendlier seasons. She offered no victory lap, no personal brand polishing, no performative round of, "I told you so." She just worked. Early mornings, late nights. Staffers noticed she spoke even more softly now, as though the noise outside didn't deserve to dictate the pace inside. Her office door, always slightly ajar, remained open. But her focus had narrowed. This wasn't about a scandal. It wasn't about Trump. It wasn't even about the USB anymore. It was about making sure that no one ever had to slip evidence under a locked door again, because the system should have been looking in the first place. And maybe now, it finally was. It didn't begin with a headline, or a rally, or a fiery speech. It began in a quiet high school classroom in upstate New York, where a civics teacher slid a redacted contract onto a projector screen and simply asked, "What do you see that doesn't belong?" That question traveled. Soon, debate clubs from California to Georgia were turning the USB case into mock trial scenarios. Students, some too young to vote, were quoting congressional procedure better than pundits. One girl in Indiana wrote her college essay about the moment AOC didn't raise her voice, but raised the stakes. Online, something unusual happened. Redditors didn't just argue, they investigated. Volunteers mapped out suspicious contracts, flagging patterns, connecting names. One thread was titled, "The Paper Trail They Hoped You'd Never Follow." It stayed on the front page for days. TikTok wasn't far behind, but instead of drama or noise, creators slowed down. One video, just 10 seconds long, showed a close-up of AOC's hand placing the USB on the committee desk. No words, just the gesture. It was enough. Millions watched, millions understood. And through it all, she didn't post a victory thread. She didn't claim a movement. She went back to work, like she always did. The story didn't end in the chamber. It spread, in whispers, in lesson plans, in dinner table questions like, "Who's watching the money now?" Not because she demanded it, but because she reminded people they had the right to ask, and the power to keep asking. Legacy isn't always declared. Sometimes it just quietly begins. She didn't stand behind a wall of flags. No dramatic entrance. Just a plain podium, a navy blazer, and a quiet room full of waiting microphones. AOC cleared her throat once but didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke as if the people listening were already paying attention. Not to her, but to the truth. "We're not here to embarrass anyone," she said, almost like a reminder to herself. "We're here to make sure it doesn't happen again." No finger pointing, no headlines read aloud, just a calm conviction that the work wasn't about punishment. It was about protection, accountability, yes, but rooted in something steadier than outrage, the belief that people deserve better. Reporters asked follow-ups. She took none. She thanked them, nodded, and stepped away. Elon Musk didn't appear beside her, didn't speak, didn't call. But quietly, he reposted her closing line. No caption, just the quote. And that was enough to light up every news cycle. Days later, tucked deep inside a government archive, a clerk sealed the item with care. A small sticker, neatly printed, now rested on its surface. Exhibit 1, House Oversight Archive. No fireworks, no fanfare. Just a USB, and the silence of something that had finally been said. What if accountability didn't have to be loud to be real? This story reminds us that truth doesn't always arrive with a bang. It sometimes whispers through a USB, a retweet, or a quiet refusal to look away. AOC's restraint wasn't weakness, it was clarity, grounded in purpose. And in an era of noise, that clarity is revolutionary. It teaches us that change begins when someone decides to read what others ignore and speak when silence is safer. What would you do if the truth landed quietly at your doorstep? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe, to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.